So you have taught at lots of universities and you've traveled the world and you've been in academia now for a while and you still have retained your accent. So can you talk about that? Because it's something it's very easy to lose, particularly when you're in the English field or you're in the field
Right.
of writing.
Yeah, and I always want to start off by saying that when I talk about this, I never mean to criticize people who have lost their accents. That's a real complicated thing that has lots of reasons. It just so happened that for me, it was sort of drilled into me by my family I was raised in a family of that came from deep poverty. By the time I was a child, we were lower middle class, but my parents had lived, through the kind of poverty that Hollywood thinks everybody in Appalachia lives in. And they were really adamant that the one thing that we really had was our culture and that we shouldn't let anybody take that from us. And a lot of that came from my parents having moved very briefly up north, like a lot of Appalachians did in the 1960s in one of the great migrations, and really being the subjects of great scorn. I talk about that a little bit in my essay. And instead of it making them ashamed, it made them defiant. And so they gave that to me, that defiance to me. From a really young age, I was very aware of grammar, and I really value good grammar. And I have a lot of students who will come to me where I teach and say that, people are giving them a hard time about their Appalachian speech. And when we get really talking about it, what they're being given a hard time about is not their grammar, but it's about the way they pronounce things. And that is really problematic because there's nothing wrong with pronouncing things in a particular way based on the world that you grew up in and the culture you grew up in. I always tell them, for me, it's really important to speak in proper grammar. And for you as my student, I want you to be grammatically correct. But that has nothing to do with the way you pronounce words or colloquialisms you use, even to some degree your syntax and things like that. And I think people get real confused about that. The other thing that really troubles me is that I know that I speak grammatically correct. I know that I do. Yet I will have people tell me, people who are not from the area, they will correct me on things. Like I told somebody the other day, I said, well, join Amy and me. We're going to be talking about dialect. This is just an example, right? This would happen pretty often. And they would say, it's actually Amy and I. And I'd be, no, it's not. It would be join Amy and me. And, people think because they are from some certain place or they went to some certain school that they automatically know their grammar better than I do because I'm working class Appalachian who went to a state school, and that it's deeply rooted in classism. It's real close to racism. And those two things are forever linked. Often when I tell people that, you'll see a sort of fear go into their eyes where they feel like, oh, I'm being called out here. And I think it's important to let people, a lot of times people just don't understand the complications of that. The reason people find it so easy, the reason they feel so free, I think, to correct somebody who speaks like me is because when they hear my accent, they hear poverty. Now, lots of people from lots of different class backgrounds speak the way I do. It's not about class, it's about place, right? But media for over 100 years, and when I say media, I mostly mean film, television, comic strips, cartoons, big time, advertisements, have taught people that there is a connection between a particular kind of accent and class. They've also taught them that there's a connection to backwardness, especially if you see a character in a movie and they want to quickly introduce that character as racist or homophobic or something, they'll assign them a Southern accent or an Appalachian accent.
And
So,
that also happens with other accents as well, right? If you want a
yes,
tough guy, they've got a New York.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's shorthand. It's film shorthand. And, and sometimes people say, oh, nobody thinks that much about that. And lots of times it's used for comedy, and comedy has exemptions to some degree. But when your whole entire life, if you have no exposure to real Appalachian people, and your whole entire life you're told, oh, these people are stupid because they speak this way. These people are lazy because they speak this way, or whatever. Eventually that takes up residence in you. And then The reverse is true in that I have a lot of students who will tell me, I'm ashamed of the way I talk because people think I'm stupid, and they think that my family's lazy and that we're illiterate, and so they want to change the way they speak. And so, although it may appear to be innocent when you just look at it and, happening every once in a while, it has real ramifications on the psyche. And I just think that you shouldn't, I would never want to instill shame in somebody. Why would anybody want to hurt somebody else that way? So we should be aware of these things.
Well, and that's what your essay speaks to so beautifully.
Yeah, I'll just read the first couple of pages, and then maybe I'll read a little more later if we have time. So this is from the very beginning. I am 12, the teacher's pet. I often get to lead the class in the Pledge of Allegiance. I am the first called on when I put up my hand. I have been personally selected by Mrs. Black to write the class play about FDR. But today, Mrs. Black is absent, and we have a substitute. Sour, sullen, angry for no good reason, although in retrospect, I think it may have been because of her green, all-polyester dress suit that looked like the fabric of my granny's couch. Mrs. Black is always happy and excited about learning. This substitute teacher does not want to be here. Plus, she is from off. Off is anywhere but here, and we hear people talk about it all the time. Oh, that preacher don't know what he's talking about. He's from off. Or, she moved off and completely changed, thinks she's better than everybody now. The substitute stands at the blackboard and slaps a ruler against her hand. Her cat's eye glasses look like something a teacher would wear on the Andy Griffith Show. Well, does anyone know the answer? We are studying caves. The question she has asked is why people shouldn't touch cave walls when they are spelunking. We all know the answer because Mrs. Black gave a good presentation on it yesterday, making spelunking my new favorite word, which I have been trying to work into a sentence naturally ever since. But this woman is too hateful, and no one wants to cooperate with her. Darrell Carr does a bird call, hooty-hoo, and everybody laughs. The miserable woman's brows arching together. Have you kids not learned anything about caves? I raise my hand as I can't stand the silence stretching out across our classroom, and because I don't want her to think we're stupid. Yes, she nods to me, more exasperated than glad that I'm willing to answer. You shouldn't touch cave walls because the oil from your finger could stop a stalactite from growing. The substitute looks like she might laugh, then she looks mad again. Your answer is correct, but if you want people to take you seriously, you must stop talking like a hillbilly. I have been taught that this word is acceptable only when another hillbilly is using it. The woman is not my people. It's oil, she enunciates, not oil, and it's finger, not finger. That's the way I talk, I counter, sitting up straighter in my desk, defiant. You talk wrong, she mimics and laughs to herself. The whole class is silent. No one is laughing with her. And the shame rushing over me isn't because she's embarrassed me in front of my classmates. To them, she's only embarrassed herself. But because I know that really, she's making fun of my people. And so I think that's what it's always about to me. It never feels so much like an attack on me somehow. I don't quite know how to explain it, but it's like my parents' faces come up in front of me, and my aunts and my grandparents, and I just feel like they're being negated. And one reason is because I know that their accents were so much thicker than mine. I know that mine is just, especially when I'm speaking, like right now when I'm talking to you, it's not that I'm trying to talk differently, but over the years I have learned that I have to enunciate a little more or I'll lose half my audience. So if I was talking to my parents or anybody in my family or community, my native community, I would be talking a little bit differently. But at the same time, even in that situation, I wouldn't be talking as thickly as my parents or as my grandparents, because I think each generation it's been taken from us a little bit as we assimilate a little bit more, as we are exposed to more media, audio media, and just things like that.
We call that leveling in sociolinguistics when it begins to features
Yes.
begin to die out. Yeah, and that happens. It does happen. Like you're right, because if I go home, my husband isn't from Appalachia. He's from Richmond, Virginia, and so he's pretty aware of. He can detect the slightest change in the way that I speak.
Yeah.
He says when I go home, it's very, very different because I'm
Right.
around my family, and they do, particularly my grandmother, and they do sound very different. And that's such a powerful essay. And back when I was reading more from Talking Appalachian, that was always the excerpt that I read from. And I mean, I've seen people cry, maybe you have too. And I think, sometimes the teacher in us too, those of us that are teachers, you think, have I ever done that? And not to that extent. I mean, I know I've never tried to be mean to anyone, but have I ever made someone feel like they were devalued, in the way that I taught them? And so it's such a power, and the fact that stayed with you well into adulthood. And there's more to that story, which you're probably going to read later. There's way more to that story, and OIL comes back. One of the themes that in part 2 of Talking Appalachian with people who wrote for that particular part, which was what it means to be a speaker, a native speaker of Appalachian dialects, is there comes a point where they sort of have a crisis about it. Even George Eller wrote about that in Boy's Place. And Lee Smith has said this: you have to go somewhere else to get some culture, right? Because we don't recognize that it's who we are in the moment, and then you come back to it. There's a pivotal point. Crystal Wilkinson writes about this. There's a pivotal point where you come back to it and you begin to own it. Did that happen for you?
I don't really remember having. I mean, I've certainly heard lots of people talk about that. I just think it had been so drilled into me. That was such a thing of my family. However, when my first book was published and I had to go on book tour, I was terrified that I would stand up to read and half the audience would get up and leave. And I began to really obsess about it. And Lee Smith, who has been a mentor to Amy and both of us and lots of people, a great writer from Southwest Virginia, I was with her at a writing conference, and I told her how scared I was of that. And she said, well, honey, just be yourself, and if they don't like it, that's just tough, just too bad. And somehow, I mean, it was just such a common sense response, but it was also a very Appalachian response, and it just freed me to think, well, that's exactly what my family's been saying the whole time. If somebody doesn't like it, it's too bad. I'm not doing anything incorrect, and I'm just being who I am. And in a way, I'm preserving something of my family that might be lost otherwise, because like I said, it is less in me. I don't think I ever consciously set out to preserve it or anything, but as a writer and somebody who's in the literary world and in the academic world, I'm definitely more aware of it. I think about it all the time. And a lot of it I think about because my students talk to me about it. I know it's an issue for them, and I want to be somebody for them to point to or to come to,
Right. So we have one question in the Q&A about the difference in northern and southern accents. And that's a good question because Appalachia is such a long region. There is no one way of speaking. I mean, if you think about Pittsburgh, which is in Appalachia, there's Pittsburghese, which is, there are you'll hear people say "warsh" in Pittsburgh, just like you'll hear them say it here. But they have different vocabulary for things. They have different pronunciations for words. And so to answer that question, along the Appalachian corridor, there are literally hundreds of dialect variations, right? From Western Pennsylvania down to West Virginia to Central to Southern. What we aren't is we're not Deep South. Mm-hmm. That's a very different thing. And I think you changed my mind. Now this is a hot topic right here. You changed my mind about Appalachia versus Appa-la-cha. Uh-huh. So I used to be one of those people that Appalachia is absolutely wrong. It's absolutely wrong. And can you speak to that? Because it caused me to shift the way that I think.
Well, the way I think about it is a lot of people do get really forceful and say, they'll really insult people who say Appalachia, Appa-la-cha. I can't even hardly say it the other way. But some people do get really angry about it. And my response is, if that's the way people in Western Maryland say it, then what's wrong with that? The word is beautiful no matter what. It looks beautiful. It sounds beautiful. It just happens to be pronounced Appalachia where I'm from. I grew up between two towns. One was Oneida, Kentucky, and one was Oneida, Tennessee. Nobody ever thought a thing about that. They were spelled exactly the same way, but just because of that, I don't know, 80 miles between them, there was a different pronunciation. So what, So I don't like for people to correct me on something like that. If that's the way I've pronounced it all my life, and lots of people around me have, so why would I do the same thing to somebody who says Appalachia? It doesn't sound right to me, but that's because, you hear something, you're told all your life that 1 + 1 = 2. Well, you think that all your life, right? But that doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong for somebody to pronounce it differently.
Right. And we've got somebody in the chat that's talking about her grandmother from near Pittsburgh who would say yins instead of yuins, and we pronounced it Appalachia. So, and that's the key point, particularly if someone identifies as Appalachian and they're saying Appalachia.
Exactly.
That's how they were raised to say it. But now we've got a question, but what about correcting people who aren't from the region and who are using it that way?
Well, I think the key word is correcting. I would, if somebody said that to me and they were talking, I would never stop them and say, well, actually, we pronounce it this way. I would only volunteer that if they asked me, how you feel about that. And then I would say, well, my preferred pronunciation is Appalachia. It just feels more correct. And as I understand it, it is closer to the root word, which comes from Appa-la-cha, right? Which was the Sotos group brought that word up from Florida. Actually, it was a Native American tribe in Florida, but they sort of put Appalachia over the whole South, but it happened to be over the mountains. It was one of those map making things, and that's how we became Appalachia. Isn't that right?
And I think, I may be mistaken, but I think it actually means sea, and they got confused and put it on the mountains instead of the ocean.
So, that's why language is endlessly fascinating, little things like that. So, I just think there are a lot more important things for us to worry about in Appalachia.
There are, that's for sure. We've got people in the chat right now saying they're from Appalachia and they use the long A, and thank you for for finally saying that it's okay.
Right.
But you'll still get people that will say, I'm sorry, I can't accept it.
Well, people will fight you over.
Yeah, they will fight you. And it's interesting to me. That's such an interesting aspect of language. Mm-hmm. It's what we talk about so much in my class, is why does it invoke such passion in people. Yeah. And that's because we attach such strong emotion to the way things are pronounced, because of memories, because of connections to our culture, because of connections to people.
And that reminds me, if I can, I'll try to tease this out as complexly as I can, but briefly. I was talking about all of this one time at an event, and this woman stood up and she had a very thick New Jersey accent, which I couldn't have identified, but she identified it for me, told me what it was. And she said, I'm negated just as much based on my accent as you are, yet you all talk about it all the time. And I understand what she's saying. However, I think when you're talking about an Appalachian accent, it goes so much deeper class-wise. And there are so many more stereotypes attached to it that just about anybody can name off. I don't really know anything about the culture of New Jersey enough to make any kind of judgment calls about an accent and all that, but I think a lot of people around the United States could hear an Appalachian accent, and there's been so much media that they have assumptions, and so much of it is class. It's all about class, of course. And I think that has been used against us when you look at the history of the way corporations have taken advantage of the region.
Question: can you give advice for people who are being told they speak wrong or weird, and how to let people know that criticism is hurtful.
I do it all the time.
Yeah, we do. It's like, where do we start?
I don't know if I can get to that part of the essay. So
we'll just read what you.
I'm going to read this little part about my parents to sort of pick back up on why I always think of my people. And then I'll go back to that.
Okay.
Try to answer that. My parents left the mountains briefly in the late 60s to find work. There was nothing for us back home except for me to work in the mines or at some gas station, and for your mother to be a waitress, my father explains. So they went north. 2 of my paternal uncles had already settled in Hamilton, Ohio, another one to Michigan, and one of my mother's sisters had recently moved to Dayton. They sent back news of good-paying jobs. On their visits home, my aunts chattered about the big department stores and how the schools were so much better and how they had washer-dryer sets up north, while my uncles bragged about bars being on every corner and their newfound ability to own Corvettes. To hear them tell it, it was the promised land. My parents ventured to Flint, Michigan, where they rented a trailer in a little Appa-la-cha trailer park and immediately found jobs with good wages. My father poured concrete on the Flint River Flood Control Project, while my mother built refrigerators at the Gibson plant. My father didn't have trouble up north. He'd had his fair share of discrimination in the Army, where boys who talked like him were singled out as stupid hillbillies. Once, at Fort Hood, Texas, during an alert in the middle of the night, my father had struggled to get his shoes on due to being half drunk and sleepy-eyed. A fellow soldier laughed at him. "What's wrong, hillbilly? Not used to putting on shoes?" My father, remembering how hard his mother had worked to raise him and his 8 siblings alone after my grandfather died, rose up with fists flying. He and the man had fought all over the barrack. Perhaps once he got north, he didn't even hear the put-downs anymore. Or maybe the country-come-to-town gleam was not as bright on him as on my mother. That rural glimmer was only one of the things that shone out from her. She had a natural ability to make friends. She impressed them with her wild tales of having been a driver in the Manchester drag races and with her singing prowess. Before long, everyone was gathered around her during lunch, demanding Loretta Lynn and Brenda Lee songs. "I couldn't eat my lunch for 'em wanting me to sing," she says now. She was surprised that Northerners loved country music so much, but eventually she realized that they were making fun of her, too. The lunchtime group crowded around her while they ate exotic dishes like goulash and mushroom sandwiches. My mother preferred bologna or cans of Viennese sausages, Viennes in eastern Kentucky parlance. And after she sang for them, they asked for another kind of performance. This one girl said she had to watch my mouth when I talked because she couldn't understand what I was saying, my mother tells me, reenacting the way the woman stared at her lips. They'd make me say stuff like aluminum foil and just die laughing. She says, I picture the factory workers inching closer, all at the same time as if choreographed, studying my mother as if she is a late 60s version of Gertie Neville's. "What's that shiny stuff you wrap up leftovers in?" one said around the cigarette in her mouth, elbowing a coworker. At the time she smiled and sometimes laughed along with them, but in retrospect she wishes she hadn't. "I just wanted to get along and be accepted," my mother says now, not meeting my eyes. "Sometimes it made me feel bad, though. I felt like they thought I was dumb just because of the way I pronounced things. In my family back home, we had always called it aluminum foil. But after they asked me a couple times, I finally learned to pronounce it their way, to not let them win, to not give them what they wanted. At home, though, I said it my own way. My mother had learned to pass. But she knew that there was a way of winning, too. She didn't have to fist fight the way my father had. She could defeat them quietly, one word at a time. My parents moved back to eastern Kentucky after a couple years. When I pressed them on why they returned, they are evasive. "We just missed home too bad," is the standard answer. But I wonder if there was something to the constant attention to their speech that made them miss home worse. Often I picture them driving back home, breathing a sigh of relief once they came to that place on Highway 25, where the mountains were laying out before them, once they found the curves in the road again, once they could close their eyes and breathe in the scent of kudzu or honeysuckle, once they could sit in the middle of a room and be surrounded by people who talked just like them. I mean, it's interesting to think about that because I have been in that same situation, but I get so much more emotional when I think about them in that situation. And people ask me all the time, why are you so proud to be from Appalachia? And it took me a long time to figure that out. Like, I was probably a year into my first book tour and had been asked that 100 times before I understood. And I finally understood that I think the reason that I'm so proud to be from Appalachia is because when you constantly have to defend the place you're from, it makes you more aware of what you love about it. It makes you proud of it. So I think that goes back to that pronunciation thing, right, of Appalachia. There's a ownership there to some degree, and we're so used to it feels like that there's so little that is ours. So even if you look at television over the last 25 years, we're not there. Rural people might show up very occasionally, but I don't see a representation of myself in the media. I really don't. The closest you could get to a complex portrayal of rural people, I think, would be Friday Night Lights, and that's set in Texas. But there hasn't been a really complex portrayal of Appalachian people in a long time on television. Some examples from the movies. And I hate to bring that up as like the touchstone, but we're a visual culture. That's where most people get their information, is from that sort of thing, and so it informs them about who we are.
Yes. And let's see, do you find criticism between Appalachians, Kentucky versus West Virginia, or Tennessee versus Southwest Virginia? Appalachians criticizing Appalachians?
I haven't experienced that as much as I've experienced it within Kentucky itself. Mm-hmm. Like there are some sections of Kentucky, of Eastern Kentucky, that think they are the only place that Appalachia actually exists. That drives me crazy. So I don't know why that is either, but I think it goes back to just pride of place.
And as far as dialect goes, yes, I think the same thing happens in the way that people talk about pronunciations. Brent says, thank you, Silas, for your wonderful writing and appearing on this program, and mentions a documentary from a native of Pike County named Ashley York.
Yes, I was one of the subjects and the executive producer of a film called Hillbilly. Mm-hmm. You can watch it on Hulu. It started out being about media representation of Appalachian people, rural working class people. And it still is about that, but it also involves the 2016 election, because once again, over and over and over, rural people were being held up in this real generalized way, and especially Appalachian people. And I wanted to go back real quickly, Amy, to what you said about many different kinds of accents. It's not even from city to city or county to county. It can be from holler to holler, right? And so it made me think about how one thing I always remind people is there is no monolith, There is no monolithic Appalachia. There are many Appalachias. There are many different foodways. One thing that is really special to where I'm from, that we consider a source of great community, and it's something that a lot of us have in common and talk about, is the love for pickled bologna. But if you get down in like Western North Carolina, and I don't even know if Southwest Virginia that's a thing.
I don't eat it, but it doesn't mean it's not a thing. I don't like much pickled anything.
Right.
But.
And so like in West Virginia, the big thing is pepperoni rolls, which mm-hmm. the miners popularized. And so, each part of Appalachia has its own foodways, its own way of speaking, its own culture. And there may be similarities, but I just think it's important to point out there's no particular way to be Appalachian. And lots of times people will say to me, you have such an Appalachian accent. And I always say, well, there are many, this is not the only one.
And we're getting so many questions. How do you handle it? How do you deal with it? How do you respond? And I respond, and that's why, I teach this class. I work a lot with teachers, and it's a paradigm shift for people because, when you have been told from kindergarten forward that, there's a binary in language and there's a right way and a wrong way. Yep. And we fall into the wrong side. That's a very hard mindset to change. Even if you're a proud Appalachian, that's a very hard mindset to change, especially as a teacher, because it's confusing and it's complicated. Mm-hmm. But I really think educating yourself about why, Linda Scott DeRosier has a quote that I love. She says, I carry my heritage in my mouth.
Mm-hmm.
I love that quote, and I use it all the time, just like I use George Ella's word voice place. I think people respond. I think people have such a knee-jerk reaction for all the reasons we talked about in the media and so forth, and classism. But I think a lot of it is ignorance.
Yes.
If you don't know that our dialect variations come from migration patterns and, they go back centuries. I mean, there are features, like Linda Scott DeRozier says, that we carry in our mouths that go all the way back to the days of Old English. It doesn't mean we speak Old English, but we still have holdovers, and that's due to migration. I mean, there's so many sociocultural factors.
Yes.
That the bottom line is, it's not random. It's not broken. It's not a failed attempt at standard English. It is a rule governed, code governed language with lots of variation. And that's why we had such a hard time with the title of the book. We tried to call it Appalachian English, and the critics came back and said, nope, because there isn't one Appalachian English, and then we tried Appalachian Englishes, and they said, well, that'll be confusing. And so we ended up talking Appalachian.
That's perfect.
But no matter, there's still, it's still problematic, because it's really hard to pin down what you do, call something so complex.
Yeah.
Right? With so many layers. On one hand, there are some people you're never going to change. You're never going to change their mind. I mean, I have had so much eye rolling and head shaking in some workshops I've done. Like, no, I can't do this. It's just like some people will never be able to say Appa-la-cha,
right.
or accept it. And that's fine.
It's the same way that I cannot naturally say oil. I mean, my mouth, if I say that in a sentence, I have to pause before and after the word. It's just not natural there's a certain way we hold our mouths, I think,
right,
as speakers from certain places.
Yes.
To answer that question a little bit, for me, it's a case-by-case basis. For me, I think it's real easy to understand when somebody's being a smart aleck, when somebody's being malicious. And it is very rare that people are doing that. Most of the time, it is just a place of real ignorance, that they just don't know that they're being insulting. I think the thing that bothers me more than anything is when people repeat back something to me the way the teacher did in that essay, when she says something like, you talk wrong. That really burns me up. And when somebody does that, I'm like, all right, all bets are off. And I will just say, that's really rude to mimic somebody to their face. My diplomacy's gone when they do that. And I mean, that hasn't happened too much, but it's happened more than I can believe. It shocks me every time it happens. And people will often do that, and they'll repeat back what I say. And lots of times I don't even understand that things that I'm saying are any different than what everybody else is saying.
And it's disappointing to me when people whose vocation centers around language uses it as a weapon against other people, or they use it to bully other people, and they may not realize that's what they're doing, but it is.
It happens all the time in the literary world and the academic world, and frankly, I think it's because both of those worlds are largely populated by, I think there are fewer working class people of working class origins in the world of academia and the literary world. I'm always shocked by how moneyed the literary world is, how most writers were raised with, with money. And I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying it's a different way of thinking about things like that. Surprised me how often I heard things in Ireland that I heard in my own home that I don't hear in the rest of America. And so it made me real aware of how so much of that has been preserved. For instance, now this isn't all of Appalachia, but where I'm from, we use ye pretty often. And it's a real instinctual thing. Like, I can't tell you that I know when to use ye versus you in a sentence, but I do it differently. Like, I would say, well, I'll see you later. But I wouldn't say, I love ye, but I would say I love yins, and so it's just like all instinct. The first thing I noticed when I went to Ireland, I went to a restaurant and walked through the door, and the hostess was standing there, and she said, how are ye? And I'm like, God, I've just walked into my granny's house, because that's the first thing that would be said. And I heard the word quare the first time I was in Ireland, which, you don't hear anywhere in America, I don't think, except Appa-la-cha. And that's a word that we just used all the time was quare. A distortion of the word queer with a whole different connotation, just meaning something odd or different. And just things like that. So there are lots of similarities, and I learned that that Ireland's just like us in that some parts of the country have preserved that and some haven't. The west of Ireland is sort of, I think of as the Appalachia of Ireland, because that's where a lot of the preservation happens with the language, and the cultural stuff happens more often there. I think people from the west of Ireland sort of, I shouldn't say, but I think there's a conflict between the way people speak in the west of Ireland and like a Dublin way of speaking. People get real upset about stuff like that, so it's very similar. One thing is that I hadn't been anywhere when I wrote my first novel. I mean, I was a very provincial person and raised by very provincial people. I mean, I was taught to be very suspicious of anybody from not only New York City, but Lexington or Knoxville, and just things like that. Very anti-urban, very anti-city. I was sort of led to believe that, the rest, everybody else was these godless people, just things like that. And I think being thrust out into the world on book tour, the house that I'm with is really big on touring. And so I just went all over the place. Another thing that happened to me on my first book tour is that I was paired with Robert Morgan on book tour. And right around the time we went on tour, his book was picked by Oprah. And so we went from having 10 people at our readings to having 1,000 people at our reading. And so it was a trial by fire. I just had to learn to do it. And luckily, Robert Morgan's just the kindest person in the world, and, made sure that I got questions too, because they all wanted to just ask him stuff, But I think my worldview has really broadened. And at the same time that's broadened, it's allowed me to even think more about where I'm from, and to think, in a way, it's made me put it more under a microscope, if that makes sense. To some degree, even though I never left the region until I moved out of the region just 2 years ago. I now live in Lexington, which is at the edge, But I was always an outsider within the culture, just because of the way I thought about things. Just being a writer, being a gay person, being the political ideas I had, the religious ideas I had. I was always an outsider. And I think that's good for a writer, to be an outsider to some degree, Somebody mentioned something in chat I wanted to address real quickly. And they were asking about, is Appalachian accent always a rural accent? And I wanted to correct myself and say that, no, I mean, there are urban areas in Appalachia. I mean, Knoxville, Asheville, Charleston, Pittsburgh, Wheeling, Huntington. But I think that when we think about an Appalachian accent and people aren't familiar with the region, they are always thinking that people are rural. People all over the country have said things to me like, there are no cities in Appalachia. There are no black people in Appalachia. There are no gay people in Appalachia. There are no, everybody in Appalachia is white, straight Christian, etc. And this idea, I mean, yeah, we don't have as much diversity maybe as the rest of the country, but we do have diversity. Not only diversity in different kinds of people, but in different ways of being.
Right. And I think that's one of the great things about the Appalachian Studies Association conference is I think that's a great place if someone wants to understand more about diversity. And,
yes.
and I think that they're doing a great job of ensuring that message is there about the complexity of the region. I wish we had so many hours just to keep talking. I wish we were on the front porch at Hyndman in a rocking chair and just keep going, because this is so much fun. Thank you, Silas.
Thank y'all. I sure enjoyed being here. I always enjoy talking to you, Amy. So see y'all soon. Thanks.
If you'd like to hear more from Silas House, go over to our Patreon page to hear an exclusive